Hello, and welcome to the breakout session for the 2020 Capacity Building Institute, Illustrating Cultural Competency, focusing on culture and equity. I hope that you have your favorite drink and are able to receive some good information that you can take back and use in your own district. I'm Wendy Ritz from the Indiana Secondary Transition Resource Center. Our guest speaker today is Brooke Harris Garrod. Brooke is an assistant research scientist with the Center on Education and Lifelong Learning at the Indiana Institute on Disability and Community. She is also the chair of the Committee on Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at IIDC. Welcome, Brooke. I'm going to allow you to go ahead and take over and give us another session for our CBI.
Thank you, Wendy. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here today to talk about a topic that I am very passionate about. So what I've prepared today is a presentation that I entitled Critical Reflection with Transition Leaders and Educators, a focus on culture and equity. And, looking at the title, I do want you to be prepared for a lot of questions. I'm going to ask questions for us to think about, to consider, and really just work toward how we can improve our interactions with youth and families. I'll speak about it a little bit later, but Universal Design for Learning is one of the frameworks that I use in my work with teachers. My job is to really help teachers make their classrooms more equitable and inclusive. And within the framework of Universal Design for Learning, I just want to highlight that this is now a tool for you to use in a way that feels helpful and relevant for you. So if that means you need to take notes, pause the video as often as possible, whatever that looks like for you, I invite you to do it and make this tool useful for you. So with that said, let's go ahead and get going. So the aim of the presentation, with a focus on culture and equity, I invite you to critically reflect on how your knowledge about yourself, your students, and our communities can positively impact your work. And in order to do that, I'm going to invite you first to join me in focusing on ourselves. So in my work with teachers, we highlight the importance of teacher self-care. And we don't see that as a luxury. In fact, we see it as essential because teachers have the ability to determine the mood in the classroom. They have the ability to model well-being so that their students can also do it. So we're thinking about the importance of brain breaks for teachers are so important so that they can be calm and be able to care for the students in their classroom. So focusing on ourselves means that I'm going to spend a moment answering the question, who am I and why does it matter? So when I think about who I am and where I'm from, some of the things to share are that I'm Black. I'm an academic woman from Columbus, Ohio. And I do think this matters because my background very much informs my interests, experiences, and ideas about culture, equity, and education. And I think that it's important for all of us to start from that perspective, to take a moment to figure out what are the things about my experiences that might not only shape my interactions with students, but also maybe limit my ability to see or perceive certain things. So with that, I want to tell just a little bit of a story. Once upon a time in Djibouti, East Africa, I led a youth arts project called the Recycled Arts Project. Students and I repurposed recyclable materials into art and jewelry. I thought it was a great idea until I ventured into my students' neighborhoods. And so just to be clear, I want to highlight that for those of you who haven't been to Djibouti, it's a country like ours in the sense that there is a range of folks with socioeconomic statuses. It's just as diverse as any country. And I saw richness and I saw poverty that I had never seen before. But the point I'm trying to make here is that I thought it was a lovely idea to take recycled materials and turn them into art and jewelry. But I went into my students' neighborhoods and realized that their experience was so different than my experience. Growing up in Columbus, Ohio, we had the infrastructure of the sanitation department. We had recycling bins and predictable trash pickup, once a week. in my students' neighborhoods in Djibouti, I realized that they took care of their own trash. Essentially, they found ways to burn it, they found ways to bury it. And instead of recycling a can, their strategy would be to avoid the can altogether. So when you buy in bulk, when you buy produce that comes into a sack that you reuse again, that's a way to avoid a can altogether. And so this was a wake-up call for me. I realized that I was operating from assumptions, assuming that things were the same in every place, and that it really challenged my values, because I had come from this idea that, being an environmentalist meant having green products and, buying the laundry detergent that was supposed to be the kindest for the earth. And what I realized, in fact, is that it's not necessarily about the green things. It's not one way to care about the environment. Another way to care about the environment, something in Djibouti they would do, is share newspapers with everybody in the community. Instead of throwing it in the recycling bin, you genuinely share resources. And so my question for you, based on that reflection, is, have you spent enough time in your students' communities to understand their stories and challenge your own assumptions? Just think about that for a moment. I have one other story for you. Again, I mentioned that I am from Ohio. Once upon a time in Indianapolis, Indiana, I assumed that Columbus, Ohio, and Indianapolis were basically the same. I learned a loud and memorable lesson on the 4th of July. Who knew fireworks are legal in Indiana? And part of the reason that I wanted to tell that story is because we take things for granted sometimes. It's easy for you to imagine that Djibouti, this far off place, is really different, and they have culture over there. But in fact, we all have culture. And it took something like not even being mindful of this different law between Indiana and Ohio, but it took that experience and a very loud 4th of July evening for me to understand that that is something that's different. I've heard people say that, culture is to humans as water is to fish. Sometimes we can't see our own culture unless we take a step back, or unless someone from the outside tells us what our culture is. But I think it's important for us to be able to recognize our own culture when we work with students that are different from us. And so my question for you, based on that story and reflection, is, what cultural differences have you overlooked by assuming you and your students were the same? Again, I hope that you will spend time thinking about these, maybe even writing in your journal to yourself. This idea of reflection is an ongoing practice. So with that, I wanted to show you a little of the resources that I think about that support this importance of storytelling and reflecting. So I have 2 resources for you, and I do have a reference list at the end of the presentation. So hopefully you will follow up with those resources if they're interesting to you. But we have a scholar named Sina Skelton, who's local. She is in Indianapolis, and she talks about this idea of an equity story. And she asks us, what are the formative experiences that have shaped your thoughts about and commitment to equity? And the idea here is that most of us doing work in this field have a reason that we were concerned about working with students with disabilities or being committed to equity. So find time to really reflect on that and figure out what draws you to the work. What's your equity story? Another resource would be by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and this is actually a TED Talk that is called The Danger of a Single Story, that came out in 2019. But she tells stories about being a young writer in Nigeria and how she wrote about things like apples and snow, even though they weren't actually from her culture. She sort of just assumed that writers and stories use these kinds of things because those happened in the stories that she read. And she talked also about what it was like for her to come to the United States as a university student and the silly assumptions people made about what it was like for her back in Nigeria. So the question from her TED Talk and her general story is, what single stories do you tell about yourself and others that contribute to your stories and perspectives? The point here is that we can make assumptions about our students, We can have a single story about why things maybe aren't going so well for them or why they're not accessing the resources that you've suggested. But in fact, there's always more to the story. And even people from the same culture don't have necessarily the same story. So my questions for reflection in this section of the presentation that I call Focusing on Ourselves, my questions are, what is your story, or what is your equity story? Include descriptions of your culture and cultural values. Number 2, what single stories about your students and their families should you complicate or deepen? Ask more questions, do a little more research, go visit their neighborhoods, complicate the story a little bit. And number 3, how do your culture, values, and stories shape your work? This is unavoidable that our experiences shape the way we see the world. But if we don't critically reflect on those things, we might be missing something. So before we move to what I consider to be the second part of the presentation, I wanted to take a moment to focus on our big ideas. So in saying that, what I mean is that I can talk about where I come from, but I think that also means that not just the place, but perhaps the ideas. So I think about it as like, where do I belong in the library? And so academics like to use this word positionality. What is your positionality? And the challenge here is develop an ability to locate yourself in the tensions that characterize fields of knowledge. Patty Lather was a professor of mine in graduate school, and that was her challenge for us. Figure out, like I said, where do you belong in the library? You know, who is writing about, thinking about the same things that you are writing about and thinking about? And so in order to demonstrate a little bit about where I come from ideologically, I wanted to highlight 3 books. Culturally Sustaining Pedagogies is the first one. And the thing about this book, the editors are Django Paris and H. Sami Alim, but some of the chapters are written by my friends, my former professors, my academic advisor. So this is really a book that represents where I'm from, my ideas and things that are really guiding me. The second one is Decolonizing Methodologies by Linda Tahawai Smith. And she talks about the dirty past of research, particularly in Indigenous communities, and the things that we can do to make sure that our interactions are culturally appropriate. So that book is really, has really been motivating for me when I think about working in communities that are not my own. How can I make those interactions responsible and culturally appropriate? And the last one is Culturally Responsive Design for English Learners. Louis Lord Nelson is a colleague of ours that we work with under this framework of Universal Design for Learning. So she and Patty Kelly Ralabate put that book out not too long ago. And basically what they do in this book is what they call braiding UDL, Universal Design for Learning, and culturally responsive teaching. And so those 3 books are part of the questions and suggestions that I'm going to present next. All right, so when we focus on our students, we're bringing in our own cultures, we're bringing in our big ideas, and that's what we're going to talk about next. I was thinking about, what are the potential barriers when working with diverse youth and families? Thinking about my own experience, but also what does the literature tell us? And so I came up with 4 things. I have many more, but for the sake of the presentation, I have 4. The first one is the idea that non-dominant languages and cultures are devalued in schools and society. So when I put CSP in parentheses, that means it comes from the book I mentioned, Culturally Sustaining Pedagogies. The idea here is that if you think about it, culture in school is most likely middle class, most likely white, most likely English dominant. That in general is the culture in many schools, particularly in the Midwest where we live. And the idea here is that when we have that dominant culture, then people that don't have that same culture find ways that they are devalued in schools. And I think that the same is true in society. The second one is the idea that deficit language is detrimental and pervasive. Again, this comes from Culturally Sustaining Pedagogies. And what I wanted to say about this is that I do think language is important. I also think it's important for us sometimes to use labels and words to identify the needs of our students and then the resources that they need. But think about this for a moment. We have ideas like at risk. Students are at risk of something, and that is very much framed from a value perspective. So right now we're living in a time where COVID-19 has closed our schools. So if we think about it, all of our students are experiencing an interruption in formal education. That is a weighted statement. And when we thought about it before COVID-19, it might meant a particular group of students, oftentimes those who have migrated or moved. Sometimes it falls into the category of those who are English learners. But there's this idea that part of the reason that they're maybe not doing so great in school is because their formal education has been interrupted. Now that we could say that about all students, will that change the meaning of that term? So like I said, I think terminology is important, but let's critically reflect on what it could mean and how it could have a negative impact. Another idea is that research and education have a sordid history in what we call BIPOC, or Black, Indigenous, People of Color communities. And that idea comes from decolonizing methodologies that I mentioned before. One other thing to take away from this idea is that, actually, let me use this example. Let's go all the way back to segregation, desegregated schools. Now, I want to be very clear about what I'm saying here, but I want to just highlight the example that before desegregated schools, what we found historically in Black communities was Black students with Black teachers who came from the same community, who knew the parents, who understood the culture, and had very high expectations of their students. When we desegregated schools, we found that it was the same kind of problems that we were talking about in terms of barriers of having teachers that don't fully understand cultures, or perhaps don't understand language, or who have a preference for a certain way of being in school. And so though that is an example to highlight the history of what it is to have outsiders providing education, or outsiders coming into a community and conducting research. And so Linda Tahaway Smith, the author of Decolonizing Methodologies, tells stories about what it was like for researchers to come into Indigenous communities and to value some of the things that they consider to be important, like valuing the knowledge of elders or respecting sacred lands. And so if you think about why you might be having a cultural clash with some of the people that you're working with, just know that there is a deep history. The last one is this idea that information is not accessible for all languages and cultures. And that comes from that book I mentioned, where UDL and culturally responsive teaching are braided together. There's this idea that we can find ways to provide information. Some people need to look at paper. Some people like digital resources. Some people need to write. Some people need to read or hear. There's all different ways to get information across. And language, the idea that maybe it's Spanish or English, is not the only one. So those are some of the barriers, but I do have some ideas. One of them would be recognize the value and richness in multiple cultures and language, including youth cultures. I think sometimes we like to assume that the kids don't have really rich cultures, but they do. And Fortnite is a thing, and it's profound to them. And it's a way that they communicate with their friends, and they practice all kinds of literacies. And let's value the things that they know how to do and the things that they care about. Choose words and labels critically and carefully. Like I mentioned before, let's critically analyze the ways that we label students. Again, we want them to get the resources that they need, but let's think about when those labels can be detrimental. And I challenge you to be a language change maker if necessary. Value local ways of knowing, like I mentioned, showing respect for elders and lands. I know in Djibouti, I know in some of the rural communities that I've worked with before, the first thing you do is have a cup of tea. You're not going to talk business until you've done that. And so I think that that is a way of showing respect for local ways of knowing. And then draw from universal design for learning and use multiple means to make information accessible in multiple ways. So again, this idea that think about all the critical ways that people might absorb information and find out if we can adapt our resources information to make it more accessible. The last thing I wanted to say, actually, I'm not sure if it's the last one, hold tight. I wanted to highlight this idea of destigmatizing difference. Difference is difference. That's all it is. It doesn't have to be bad just because it's different. There we go. The last one, acknowledge the societal and structural patterns of inequities. It's not just personal. And the reason I say this is because sometimes we think that if an individual person has had a negative experience in terms of race or culture, we sometimes think that maybe is related to something that person did. But I think that it's important, if we want to work towards equity, to acknowledge some of the history that I mentioned, to acknowledge the fact that some of these things are indeed built into society since the beginning of time. And so I think having that perspective will allow us to have a wider view of things to be able to work towards equity. Okay, so before we move to the next section, a question for focusing on our students is, how are you making your materials and interactions culturally and linguistically accessible? I'm not saying necessarily to go out and learn Spanish right now and to translate all your materials, but I do think there are certain things that we can use. Maybe the language that's a little bit more neutral or inclusive. Maybe our interactions, again, that honor the elders or have a cup of tea first. How can you make your interactions more accessible and along with your materials? So another question for reflection that I hope you continue to think about. All right, so moving to the next portion of the presentation, I wanted to talk about focusing on our communities. And here, what I wanted to say actually is that I looked back at the institute from last year, the Capacity Building Institute, CBI, and wanted to think about what are the issues that you talked about last year. I saw a lot of names of my colleagues like Betty Lou Rowe and Kathy Pratt, and I realized that there are many common concerns among transition-focused educators and educators that are oriented toward culture and equity. So why do you think that would be? And I was thinking to myself, like, spoiler alert, it's because transition-focused educators are obviously already equity-oriented. And so my push, I guess, is to also just think about it in terms of culture. So one of the things that the folks last year talked about is this idea of the importance of student-led IEPs and self-advocacy. Self-advocacy is a really big deal when we talk about cultural difference. It's a common theme. So one of my questions would be, how can we honor students' multiple cultural selves? That comes from UDL, or Universal Design for Learning. They say multiple cultural selves. But how can we honor students' multiple cultural selves and learn from them? This is a way to honor student voice, to allow them to advocate for making space for themselves and their needs. So this is a very similar concern. And Betty Lou Rowe, my colleague, talked about the stigma around mental health. And so what I would add from someone concerned about cultural equity would be, mental health is linked to language, race, and cultural discrimination. So we want to just acknowledge that this could be part of the unique experience that a student is having if they are a person of color or a student who speaks a language that is non-dominant in the community where they are. So again, very common themes with similar concerns. Some other ones would be assistive technology. There's lots of reasons why people need assistive technology, but one of them, when we're thinking about the cultural differences, could be captions for English learners. I know personally that I'm a French learner, and so I like to watch French films and have the captions on so that I can read along. So this is just an example of how it could be broadly useful for lots of different reasons, but it still comes from a similar concern of accessibility. Another one is this idea of family-oriented pedagogies and practices. We want our families to be involved. We want to be in constant communication with them so we better understand their needs and therefore the services that we might offer or recommend. So how can we connect families to culturally appropriate services and resources? I just think this is something that is a more profound question than it could seem on the surface, but just thinking about, you know, who we recommend a family to go see, if they're from the same faith community, if they speak a similar language, that could be a way for them to really be able to understand what is being suggested for them to take advantage of. And this idea of high expectations for students and children is almost self-explanatory. So I don't have any little bullet point under that, but just again, this idea that we all have a common concern of wanting our students to be challenged, to get the best. We have high expectations for what they're able to do, you know, when they transition from high school into the workforce or adulthood and beyond. So that is a very common concern that the CBI talked about last year, and that I have seen in the literature and in my work as well. So my question when we're talking about focusing on community is, how can a focus on culture and equity enrich your work in community? Like I mentioned, your equity oriented educators as well. How have you deepened your practice by thinking about culture in explicit ways? Okay. And so some final big ideas as I work toward wrapping it up. Some final reflection questions. Where are you from, both geographically and ideologically? How have your origins shaped your values, perspectives, and the way you work with youth and families? So again, I'm from Ohio, but I also find myself in, you know, the critical scholar, cultural studies part of the library. And I think it's important to know that those lenses could help me see the world, but also limit my perspectives. So I challenge you to think about that. Maybe spend some time writing these answers, you know, press pause, find a way to answer that question for yourself. Another question would be, what are your students' stories? How can they inform both your process of critical self-reflection and your interactions with them? So again, going back to my story in Djibouti, I made an assumption about what my students' neighborhoods might look like, was not at all what I thought it was going to be. I should have spent more time asking them, you know, where they come from, what it's like in their neighborhoods, what would be relevant for us to do together. It's a good place to start, I think. And then thinking about our common goals among students, families, and educators, how can a focus on culture and equity inform your work? Like I mentioned, we're all equity educators. We're concerned about common themes and common things for our students. We all have the same goals of having them make transitions and be successful beyond high school. So just thinking about that, you know, how can focusing on their culture as well inform and enrich your practice? So before I finish up, I wanted to also just reiterate some of the strategies with an equity and culture in focus. So continue to regularly self-reflect. Sometimes it's painful when you think about, man, I didn't do that right. Man, the literature tells me to do the exact opposite. You know, but to be able to regularly practice this won't feel as if you're being so hard on yourself. It will be moving toward the desire to do an even better job with the next family or the next time you meet with a family. Challenge yourself to avoid single stories or deficit narratives. Again, the language we use to talk about our students is important. The stories that we use to think about who they are important. And we can do this with ourselves as well. I think it's important to focus on our multiple stories and positive language to describe ourselves and our families. Acknowledge cultural differences, don't be neutral to them, and operate from the assumption that all cultures are rich. So when I say don't be neutral to cultural differences, don't assume that a difference is small. In fact, it could be something much bigger. Take inventory of your resources. Do they reflect the youth with whom you work? I have not drawn your attention to the fact that I'm sitting in front of my bookshelf, but on this bookshelf, I've got a lot of different books that, like I mentioned, represent where I think I'm from ideologically, but also the students that I work with. If I feel like I don't know well the story of a student, One of the ways is obviously to talk more with them and their families. But another thing to do would be to find a book written by someone from their community and to do a little bit of a deeper dive to try to begin to understand a little bit more of who they are. So if you look at your books, are they as diverse as the students and families that you work with? If not, it's a great time to go to the library. The other strategy I offer is this idea of acknowledging inequities, then working to dismantle them in your own work and beyond. I think it's important for us to recognize that things are not the same for everyone, but to assume that those inequities aren't really such a big deal is probably not what we want to do. So join me and other educators working toward equity to dismantle inequities in your work and beyond. So these are some of the references that I mentioned. Please take a screenshot, whatever it is that you need to do to be able to look into those if you are interested in learning more. And that's what I have for you today. So thank you so much for your time and attention. Here is my contact information. I would love to continue speaking with you about any of these topics. And that's it. Thank you so much.